I refused to let my brother's family stay with me after they lost their home. Look, I have a modest 3-bedroom house that I bought 5 years ago. I live alone, use one bedroom as an office and the other as a guest hobby room where I keep my music equipment and console. My brother and his wife lost their house due to money problems. They have 3 kids. Their issues stem from a series of terrible decisions. My brother lost his well-paying job 2 years ago because he was always late. Then he kept switching jobs while his wife worked part-time. They kept their kids in ridiculously expensive private schools and activities they couldn't afford, refused to downsize their huge house, and ignored financial advice from my parents and me. In the end, they couldn't pay their mortgage and got evicted. When they lost their house, they asked if they could stay with me just for a few months until they got back on their feet. Here's where I might be the asshole. I said no. Instead of letting them move in, I offered to pay for a hotel for 2 weeks and help them find an affordable apartment. I also offered to cover their deposit. My brother exploded, calling me selfish and saying I had plenty of space and was choosing material things over family. My parents are divided. They understand my stance but think I could manage temporarily. Since then, my brother's family moved in with my parents, and I've been getting constant messages from extended family about how I abandoned my brother in his time of need. My sister-in-law has been posting passive-aggressive stuff on social media about finding out who your real family is in hard times. And here's where things get worse. Not only have they been living with my parents, but their house has turned into complete chaos. At first, my parents were happy to help, but they quickly noticed that my brother and his wife weren't contributing at all. They didn't help with expenses, let my parents do everything for them, and worst of all, didn't even seem to be looking for a new place to live. My nephews, though not at fault, have wreaked havoc in my parents' house. They broke a couple of my mom's valuable decorations, drew all over the walls, and according to my dad, even got into fights with the neighborhood kids. All this has made my parents start to regret their decision. But, of course, they don't know how to tell them to leave without seeming like the bad guys. Meanwhile, my brother keeps insisting that I'm the selfish one. He recently sent me a message saying, "I hope you're never in my situation and someone slams the door in your face." Honestly, I thought about it for a moment, but then I remembered how they got into this mess. It wasn't bad luck, it was bad choices. But the story doesn't end there. The tension in the family keeps growing. A week ago, my mom called me saying she was exhausted. She said my brother and his wife had turned the house into a disaster, that she couldn't take it anymore, and that she wanted them to find a new place. When I suggested she tell them this directly, she sighed and said, "You know it's not that easy." Meanwhile, my sister-in-law keeps throwing hints on social media. The last one I saw said something like, "Some people pretend to be family, but they really have no heart." At this point, I almost find it funny how dramatic she is. But what really worries me is that there's no easy solution to this. My parents are getting drained, my brother doesn't seem willing to change, and I'm still the villain of the story to everyone else. What I wonder is, how much longer can this go on? How will it all end? Weeks passed, and the tension in the family kept escalating. My parents, who were convinced at first that they could handle the situation, were now at their breaking point. My mom called me more and more often to vent, telling me how the house was in terrible shape. According to her, my brother and his wife barely helped with household chores, the kids were out of control, and the grocery bill had doubled. In a desperate attempt to fix things, my dad tried to have a conversation with my brother about the possibility of moving out. "Son, we need to find a solution to this situation. This isn't sustainable," he told him. My brother's reaction was exactly what we feared. Instead of accepting reality, he got outraged. He said they were kicking him out, that he had always been treated as the problematic son, and that if they really cared about his well-being, they would give him more time. My sister-in-law didn't hold back either. After that conversation, her social media posts became even more venomous. Phrases like, "Some people are only there when things are good," or "It hurts when you realize family isn't always there to support you," became her recurring theme. The worst part is that, despite how obvious the situation was, some relatives started sympathizing with them. I received a message from an aunt saying, "Maybe you should do more," the same aunt who hasn't done absolutely anything to help them. I tried to avoid direct conflicts, but my patience had its limits. At a family gathering, someone hinted that I should stop being so selfish and open my door to them. I took a deep breath before responding, but I didn't hold back. Alright, let's be clear. I offered to pay for a hotel, help them with the deposit for an apartment, even look for options for them. Don't ask me to sacrifice my home and my peace when they're not even doing anything to fix their situation. The silence at the table was absolute. Some relatives avoided looking at me, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My brother, of course, wasn't present, but my mother was. She didn't say anything at that moment, but later she sent me a message. I didn't want to say it in front of everyone, but you're right. We can't keep going like this. Seemed like my parents had finally reached their limit. I confirmed it when my father called me a few days later and said in a serious tone, "We've decided to give them an ultimatum. They have 2 months to find a place. We can't keep going like this." I was surprised, but at the same time I felt a sense of relief. The situation had been unsustainable for too long, and my parents were finally taking action. My brother's reaction was predictable. When they gave him the news, he exploded in rage. "You're abandoning us. You're leaving us on the street," he shouted, while my sister-in-law dramatically cried in a corner. "You don't care about us at all. You just want to get rid of us," she added between sobs. But my parents stood firm. "It's not that we don't care about you, it's that we need to get our lives back. This can't go on," they told him. From that day on, the atmosphere in my parents' house became unbearable. My brother and his wife barely spoke to them. Kids, oblivious to the tension, continued their boundless energy, while my parents tried to ignore the passive-aggressive comments thrown around at the table. My mother confessed that the situation was taking a toll on her emotionally and that she had even considered giving in, but my father convinced her that they had to stand their ground. "If we give in, they'll never leave," he told her. Meanwhile, on social media, my sister-in-law's victim campaign reached new heights. "When you need them most, they abandon you. I don't understand how someone can be so cold to their own family," and similar indirect posts flooded her profile. Some of her friends left supportive comments, unaware of the full story. As for me, I decided to block her. There was no point in continuing to see her toxicity. The ultimatum had been given, but the question remained. Would they actually leave when the deadline arrived? Or worse, would they drag it out until the very last day, hoping my parents would cave? Meanwhile, I kept receiving comments from some family members. "You should talk to your brother. He's family, you can't just ignore him." I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to get involved any further. Not because I didn't care, but because I had already done enough. But something tells me this is far from over. Countdown had begun. With the ultimatum on the table, my parents seemed determined to reclaim their home, but my brother and his wife's resistance only grew. Instead of looking for a new place to settle, they kept acting as if the situation was temporary, yet took no action to change it. My mother's complaints became more frequent. She lamented that the house was in worse shape than ever. Kids left toys and clothes everywhere, the kitchen was always a mess, and the food disappeared from the pantry at an alarming rate. "I can't remember the last time I had a moment of peace," she told me one afternoon. Her words revealed the emotional exhaustion she was going through. My father, who usually avoided confrontations, was also reaching his limit. He became stricter with house rules, trying to establish some order. But every time he called out my brother or his wife, the situation escalated. "We're not children," my sister-in-law yelled once when my father asked her to pick up her clothes from the bathroom. My brother, instead of calming things down, crossed his arms and complained that they were being treated like unwanted guests. Meanwhile, the social pressure kept growing. The extended family continued with their meddling comments, acting like they were experts in solidarity and understanding. "If I had a house, I'd let them stay as long as they needed," a cousin wrote in a family group chat. It was easy to talk when she didn't have to deal with the reality of sharing her space with 5 extra people. I chose to ignore the comments, though it was still frustrating. Days later, my mother called me again. This time her tone was different, more tired, almost defeated. "They're not looking for an apartment. They have no intention of leaving," she confessed. The news didn't surprise me. My brother and his wife had found a place where they got free shelter and food. Why would they make an effort to change that? I asked if she had spoken to them about the deadline. She assured me she had, but every time she brought it up, the conversation ended in excuses. "We haven't found anything affordable yet. Rent is too expensive. We need more time." But my mother knew they weren't really looking. She had even researched affordable options herself, but when she tried to show them, my sister-in-law just scoffed and changed the subject. The passive-aggressive posts on social media didn't stop either. Some people pretend to care, but deep down they just want to get rid of you, my sister-in-law posted, along with an image of a happy family, as if they were victims of a cruel abandonment. My patience was running thin. I decided to meet with my parents in person to talk about the situation. When I arrived at their house, the tension was palpable. My brother barely greeted me, and my sister-in-law didn't even try to hide her annoyance. I sat with my parents in the kitchen and asked them directly, "Are you going to do something if they don't leave on their own?" My father sighed and ran a hand over his face. "I don't want to get to that point, but if they keep this up, we'll have to take more drastic measures." I knew what he meant. They could resort to a legal notice, but it was something they didn't want to do. "He's still our son," my mother murmured, guilt written all over her face. In the middle of our conversation, we heard a loud crash in the living room. We rushed to see what had happened and found that one of the kids had broken a vase that had been in the family for years. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, but before she could say anything, my sister-in-law quickly said, "It was just a vase. It's not a big deal." That was the last straw for my father. "Enough," he said firmly, making everyone fall silent. "We're tired. This was supposed to be temporary, and you're not doing anything to change your situation. If you don't leave by the deadline we agreed on, we will take other measures." My brother, instead of acknowledging the situation, got defensive. "You can't do this to us. We have nowhere to go," he shouted, as if it were our parents' fault. My sister-in-law started sobbing, repeating over and over that they were family and couldn't be thrown out onto the street. But my father didn't back down. "You have 1 month, and this time we mean it." I left the house knowing that the next few weeks would be hell for my parents. My brother wasn't going to take it well, and he would probably do everything he could to manipulate the situation in his favor. I knew I would keep getting messages from relatives trying to make me feel guilty, but this time it didn't affect me anymore. The only thing I could do was wait and see what happened. 'Cause deep down, I still wondered whether my brother and his wife would actually leave when time ran out or if they would try something else to avoid it. The month passed with an increasingly heavy emotional burden in my parents' house. Not a single day went by without an argument, a snide remark, or a new complaint from my mother about the state of their home. Living together had become unbearable, and although the deadline was getting closer, my brother and his wife still weren't making any concrete moves to leave. Their excuses became more absurd. Now they argued that the real estate market was in an unsalvageable crisis, that prices were unfair, and that there were simply no opportunities. My father, tired of the same excuses, showed them several viable options in different neighborhoods, but all were dismissed with vague responses. "Too far, we don't like the area, we're not sure if it's the best option." Any suggestion was immediately rejected, as if they were waiting for my parents to give up out of exhaustion and let them stay indefinitely. Meanwhile, social tension kept rising. Passive-aggressive posts on social media turned into more direct attacks. My sister-in-law, without any shame, shared a post saying that some people had cold and inhuman hearts, accompanied by a long rant about the lack of family support in difficult times. Her circle of friends and some extended relatives quickly flooded the comments with messages of sympathy and criticism toward those who were turning their backs on them. I had already stopped paying attention to her victimization tactics, but my parents couldn't help but feel affected. My mother constantly lamented, repeating that she didn't want to be the villain of the story. "They're my grandchildren. I don't want them to think we're throwing them out on the street," she said with a furrowed brow and a distant look in her eyes. It was clear that it hurt her, but she was also at the limit of her endurance. My father, on the other hand, remained firm. "We can't keep living like this. They're not looking for stable jobs, they're making no effort to move out, and they're not even trying to help with expenses. This has to end." His stance wasn't cold or distant, just realistic. Kids, oblivious to all the drama, continued with their endless energy, but now with a more rebellious attitude. They knew their parents were in conflict with their grandparents and had become defiant. "We don't have to listen if we don't want to," the eldest told my mother one afternoon after she asked him to pick up his things from the floor. It was the first time I saw my mother completely overwhelmed by the situation. Exactly 1 week before the deadline, something happened that made everything worse. My brother and his wife announced that they had decided to extend their stay until they found something suitable. It wasn't even a conversation, it was a blunt declaration. We can't afford to move out right now, so we'll be staying a bit longer. My father, who had tried to handle the situation with patience up until that moment, lost his temper. That's not up to you, he said firmly. We gave you a month and you've done nothing to leave. In 7 days you must be out, no discussion. The argument was explosive. My brother shouted that they were his parents and that they couldn't turn their backs on him. My sister-in-law cried, repeating that they were being treated like garbage. Kids, alarmed by the fight, started crying too, adding even more chaos to the moment. I watched the scene in disbelief. I couldn't understand how, after everything, they still expected others to solve their problems while they did nothing. Inside, I no longer felt even a shred of guilt for refusing to take them into my home. If they acted this way with my parents, what would have happened if I had opened my doors to them? After that fight, the house turned into a silent battlefield. My brother and his wife stopped speaking to my parents except when absolutely necessary. Family meals were tense and cold, filled with resentful glances and whispered conversations between them. My parents stood firm, though the discomfort was evident. I tried to stay out of it, but I knew that at any moment things could explode again. I received messages from other relatives, some supporting my parents, others insisting that we should be more understanding. One of my cousins even suggested that maybe we could start a collection to help them. I bit my tongue to avoid responding with sarcasm. The most ridiculous part was when my sister-in-law, after ignoring me for weeks, sent me a direct message. Maybe we could reconsider your hotel offer if it's still available, she wrote. I stared at the screen, unsure whether to laugh or get angry. The same offer they had indignantly rejected at the beginning was now suddenly a viable option. But it was no longer my problem, I replied shortly. I can't help anymore. I never received another message from her after that. The last few days before the deadline felt endless. Every call from my mother made me wonder if they had finally packed their things or if they were still refusing to accept reality. What worried me the most was what would happen if, when the day came, they simply refused to leave. My father had already considered the possibility of taking legal action, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. I don't want to put them through that, but if they leave us no choice, we'll do it, he told me in one of our conversations. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. My mother was barely sleeping, the kids continued causing havoc, and my brother and his wife seemed convinced that if they held out long enough, my parents would eventually give in. There were only 2 days left until the deadline, and everything was still up in the air. No one knew what would happen when the final day arrived. Would my parents have to throw them out by force? Would they come up with yet another excuse to stay? Or did they have an ace up their sleeve that no one had seen coming? The final deadline arrived under an atmosphere of absolute uncertainty. My parents' house had turned into a constant field of tension, where every interaction was a reminder that the decisive moment was approaching. Despite all the warnings, my brother and his wife continued acting as if the situation could stretch on indefinitely. They hadn't packed anything, hadn't looked for a real alternative, and hadn't even shown any signs of accepting reality. My mother didn't sleep the night before. When I called her in the morning to ask how she was, her voice sounded fragile, on the verge of despair. They haven't moved a single piece of furniture. They're still acting like nothing's happening, she whispered, trying not to be overheard. Your father is losing his patience, but he doesn't want to be the one to explode first. My father, for his part, seemed to have reached his limit. For weeks, he had tried to keep his composure, but seeing that his son wasn't taking the ultimatum seriously, his patience had run out. I've given them every opportunity in the world, he told me, with the most serious tone I had ever heard from him. If they don't leave today, I'll do what needs to be done. That afternoon, I decided to stop by the house to see what was happening. When I walked in, everything felt strangely quiet, too quiet. Tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. My parents were sitting in the living room, exhaustion and frustration evident on their faces. My brother and his wife, on the other hand, seemed indifferent. They were in the kitchen with the kids, as if it were just another normal day. They hadn't made any attempt to pack or given any indication that they planned to leave on their own. It was obvious they were waiting for my parents to back down, for time to pass, and for their stay to be normalized. There was no way to avoid it. My father stood up and walked into the kitchen with a determination I had never seen in him before. "Today is the last day. You have until tonight to leave," he said coldly. "No more extensions, no more excuses." My brother stared at him as if he couldn't believe he was serious. "So you're really throwing us out?" he said with a bitter laugh. "I thought you loved us." "Love doesn't mean letting people walk all over us," my father replied without changing his tone. "We've done more than enough. We gave you time, we gave you support, but you've done nothing to improve your situation. This ends today." The argument escalated quickly. My sister-in-law, tears in her eyes, started throwing accusations. "We don't know where to go. We can't just disappear overnight." My mother, though visibly affected, remained silent. She knew that anything she said would be used against her. What no one expected was what happened next. My brother, realizing there was no way to avoid leaving, resorted to one last desperate move. "Then if we leave, we'll take some things from the house. After all, we've lived here too," he said with a defiant air. That was when my father exploded. "Don't you dare touch anything that isn't yours," he shouted with a rage I had rarely seen in him. "This is my house. If you don't want to do things the right way, then you leave with nothing." The air became suffocating. My brother and his wife were silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Finally, my sister-in-law stood up and left the room, dragging the kids with her. My brother, clenching his fists, looked at us one last time before throwing out a final remark. "You're going to regret this." They stormed off to their room and, for the first time in weeks, actually started packing. The idea of having their belongings forcibly removed had finally made them react. My parents said nothing as they watched them go back and forth with suitcases and boxes, piling them up at the entrance of the house. When night fell, a taxi arrived to pick them up. There were no goodbyes, no words of reconciliation, just a thick silence, heavy with resentment and frustration. My mother stood at the door, her expression a mixture of relief and sadness, watching as the car drove away. But the most worrying part wasn't their departure, it was what would come next. Didn't take even a day for the attacks to start. Social media flooded with dramatic posts about being betrayed by your own family. Messages from aunts, cousins, and acquaintances who didn't understand the full situation, passing judgment without knowing the complete story. And worst of all, the certainty that my brother and his wife weren't going to let this go so easily. I knew the story wasn't over. Their wounded pride would push them to try a new strategy. I couldn't help but wonder if, at some point, they would show up at my door asking for a second chance, or if they would try to turn the entire family against us until my parents caved. Calm had returned to my parents' house, but we all knew it was just the peace before the next storm. The days following my brother and his wife's departure felt strange. My parents' home, which had recently been an emotional battlefield, now felt unusually quiet. There was a silence that once seemed impossible. However, the peace was fragile. We knew this wasn't truly over. Social media became the new battleground. My sister-in-law made sure to flood it with dramatic posts. "Nothing hurts more than being rejected by those who should support you," she wrote one day, accompanying her message with a black and white image of a happy family, which was obviously not ours. Her friends and some extended family members sent her messages of support, unaware of the real details. My mother, though relieved to have her home back, couldn't help but feel guilty. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked me one night. I knew her too well not to notice that this doubt was tormenting her. "Yes, Mom. You couldn't keep living like that. It was going to destroy both you and your home," I replied. She nodded, but her face still reflected the inner conflict she carried. Meanwhile, my brother and his wife found refuge at a friend's house. It didn't take long for us to find out that they had repeated the same story, that my parents had heartlessly thrown them out and that they were practically homeless. What they failed to mention was that the so-called friend stopped hosting them after 2 weeks. Apparently, they made no effort to contribute to their stay, and the man simply kicked them out. Eventually, they were forced to rent a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the luxurious place they were used to, not even close, but it was the only thing they could afford after years of disastrous financial decisions. Out of pride, my brother avoided speaking to my parents. We only found out about their new situation through third parties. Weeks passed without direct contact until one day my brother called my mother. It was a brief and cold conversation. There were no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation, just an excuse to ask if she could help him with some money for the kids. My mother, despite everything, agreed to send him something. When my father found out, he was furious. "If you keep giving them money, they'll never learn," he warned her. But she, with the heart of a mother, couldn't help herself. The family dynamic changed. My relationship with my brother was never the same. He distanced himself, hurt by what he considered a betrayal. His wife, of course, held on to her resentment, making sure the extended family saw my parents as the villains of the story. But little by little, people stopped paying attention. Reality set in, and although some relatives still occasionally brought up the topic, most understood that my parents had done what they had to do. Over time, the tension faded. My mother went back to enjoying her home without feeling invaded, and my father was able to regain his routine without daily conflicts. Peace had returned, though not without scars. As for me, I learned an important lesson. Sometimes, no matter how much we love someone, we can't let them drag us down with them. There is a limit between helping and allowing ourselves to be taken advantage of. My brother made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. Months later, I ran into him at a family event. It was a brief encounter without many words. We looked at each other, exchanged an awkward greeting, and went on with our lives. There was no open resentment, but no reconciliation either. Just a silent acknowledgement that things were no longer the same, and perhaps they never would be.